about spinal cord injury as an example. That's what my expertise is and all of my research is in. And I have two different areas talking about how we can identify preferences of people living with spinal cord injuries or people with various disabilities to try to reduce ableism, at least in relation to the research topic that we're studying, and therefore making research more relevant. And then also, by partnering with people with disabilities, we can try to reduce ableism throughout the research cycle, and therefore make research more inclusive, meaningful, and useful. In spinal cord injury, we heard the speaker this morning talk about different models of disability. The medical model of disability is a very pervasive model in healthcare. In spinal cord injury, there's a very large amount of funding that goes towards basic science, translational research, and clinical interventions, and a very, very, very strong bias towards a medical model of disability. And it's fraught with ableism. And I personally think that there are aspects of the medical model and there's aspects of the social model that really encompass what's actually lived with spinal. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is preferences. In 2000, I came out of getting my doctorate degree, started getting immersed in the spinal cord injury research field. I was in the basic science field, and I started listening and observing and going to conferences, and I'm realizing, everybody is studying thoracic spinal cord injuries, and they're looking at walking. But I've been living with a spinal cord injury for a while. I've got lots of friends that have been living with spinal cord injury, and there's a lot more issues to deal with than just not being able to walk. And in fact, many more of the issues of the injuries are up in the neck area, in the cervical level. And so I was talking to my colleagues about this, and they said, well, Kim, until I see the data that people with cervical spinal cord injuries want arm and hand function, I'm just going to keep on doing what I'm doing. So I went out and I got the data. And this, I'm just going to give you a couple of examples, but this is a seminal study in the spinal cord injury research field that I published in 2004 that asked people with spinal cord injuries if you could have some general functional areas where you could get functional recovery. What would be your priority? And people with cervical injuries, also called tetraplegia, said regaining arm and hand function would be most important to me. And people with paraplegia said sexual function or bladder and bowel function. And this amazed the basic scientists because why didn't everybody say walking? And it's not to say that walking is not important. It's to show the fact that there's a lot of issues related to the disability of spinal cord injury. And we should be studying them all. And we should be asking people, what's important to you? What's it like to live with the injury? That same study also showed that there are shared priorities. So autonomic function is a shared priority across all spinal cord injuries. And walking is not equally rated. It's important, but it's not equally rated. The other example that this survey showed is that different priorities are important at different times in life. And so based on the duration of your injury, some things are more important early after injury and some things are more important later after injury. For example, pain becomes very important the longer that you live with spinal cord injury. And trunk stability was very important earlier after an injury. But these common themes of upper extremity function and autonomic function were pervasive across all different ways that you could analyze the data. So then over the years, many people did similar surveys and they were identifying very similar results. And I'm actually in the process of writing up a review paper right now with a fellow, and she created this wonderful graphic. Over the last 20 years, we're having the same recurring priorities: upper extremity function, bladder, bowel, sexual function. And you can see across the bottom, different aspects of spinal cord injury influence different priorities, but in general, we're having the same recurring priorities. So that tells me it's time to shift toward actually impacting these functions and making them so that people are benefiting from our research, studying these areas, and our research is actually able to impact life. But also, for research, are we actually getting people to participate in the studies that we're designing? And this is really important. Spinal cord injury, as I'm sure many different types of clinical research have hard times reaching the number of people that they say that they're going to reach when they write this convincing grant application to the funding agencies. And what is it? What can we learn from people with spinal cord injuries or other disabilities that might make it easier for them to participate in research? So a few years ago, actually, Rachel collaborated with me on this. We did a very large survey that had representation from many different countries in the world, and we asked, if you qualified for a study, would you actually participate? And we asked about different factors that might influence their decision to participate. We analyzed the data to see, were there any influence on gender, injury level, age, injury duration, and country of residence. And what we found, we were actually surprised, but we found that there were some universal factors that were facilitators or barriers to people's decision to participate. And this next graph here, you can see along the bottom are the number of responses. And the blue lines show how strongly people said that these factors would positively influence their decision to participate in a trial. And in the red are factors that have a negative influence on their decision to participate in a trial. And the gray were relatively neutral. So what we found was that there are actually some very strong facilitators. Well, you might not be surprised if someone has the possibility of improved function or increased independence, that would have a positive influence. But also, people wanted the opportunity to learn more about their spinal cord injury by being in a trial. And also the fact that they may not benefit, but somebody else in the future may benefit from them, from their participation in the study. Having very strong family support was very important, as well as recommendation from peers and personal physicians. Some strong barriers, not surprisingly, are possibility of decreased function or side effects, but also there was a perceived negative impact on income or medical coverage, and a very real possibility of out-of-pocket expenses that weren't covered by the studies. And I want to give just a couple examples of two other studies where we looked at risks and benefits of different interventions related to spinal cord injury. These two are related to upper extremity function for people with cervical injuries. There is a clinical procedure called a tendon transfer that is available everywhere. It's no longer research-based. And it takes advantage of muscles that still have some activity via tendon and innervation, and transfer that to a paralyzed muscle. You don't get full function. You only get partially, so you may get about 30% of elbow extension or maybe 50% of hand grasp. So we asked people, if you have this level of functional gain, which is not a cure, but if you have this amount of gain, would you be willing to have an intervention that involved that? And for the people in the red bars up in the top two graphs, the people that did not have that function said they would be willing to undergo a procedure for that level of function, an incremental function. On the bottom left graph, talks about the risk. Having these kinds of surgeries requires that your arm be immobilized for a couple months. And so you actually have to go through a period of being less dependent, or less independent, from the hope that you gain more independence in the future. And people said they were willing to do that for that amount of gain. But then on the lower right-hand side, we asked about, well, what's the ideal time to have this surgery? And in the red and the blue bars, the first two on the left-hand side, people said either the first year of their injury or the first 5 years of their injury. And I can tell you personally, actually, after doing this study, I learned about tendon transfers. Nobody had ever told me about them. And about 20 years after my injury, I decided to have this surgical procedure. And it was a very difficult process because I was already very ingrained in my life and in my work, and it was very difficult to go through that amount of decreased independence for the recovery. But in the end, it was worth it. The last example here is about an implanted technology for upper extremity function. And these two graphs are asking about risks related to that implanted procedure. So there are risks related to surgery. Those are around the first 30 days post-injury. And again, in blue, it talks about people's relative unconcern for those risks. And red, it talks about increasing concern. So for risk of post-surgical infection, people have a stronger concern about that. The possibility of maybe having to limit the number of times that you get in and out of your wheelchair in that 30-day period, not as much of a concern. But then in the bottom graph, those are risks related to the actual implanted device. And they go from least invasive to most invasive down to the bottom. And you can see the more invasive the risk is related to, at the very bottom, a potential problem with the implant that would require the whole thing to be removed. Is a very negative factor for that device. And so this is informative for the engineers that are designing this. You really need to be able to mitigate those risks that involve a surgical intervention to repair them, and what can you do on software coding to try to improve those issues. And lastly, knowing that level of risk, we asked people about a certain amount of success. So if we define success as a successful scenario as you had an improvement in your arm movement, you had an improvement in your hand movement, and you were able to lift or move one or more objects than you could before. And we asked people, knowing that definition of success and knowing that level of risk from the previous slide, how interested would you be in getting this device if you had a 90% chance of achieving success, or all the way down at the bottom to only a 10% chance of achieving success? And you can see the blue, again, is greater interest, all the way down to only a 50% chance of success. More than 50% of the people were interested in that scenario. So for that level of function and that degree of risk, they were very interested in that type of situation. And I'm not going to go into any more examples of that, but also in the review paper that I'm putting together, it shows for many different types of interventions. It's linked to people's priorities on their functional recovery and how they weigh those risks and benefits related to that potential recovery that they could have. So by asking people what's important to them, we can reduce the impact of ableism in research with respect to what we study and how we're approaching it. But is our research actually impacting people's lives? And how can we do better? And I propose that we can do better by actually partnering with people with disabilities, spinal cord injury in this particular example, throughout the entire research cycle. So this graphic here shows up at the very top. You're developing a research question. You're putting together your grant to get funded, or you're developing your methods. Then you're lucky enough to get funded, and you do your research, you analyze the data, you publish it, you disseminate it, you have your next research question, and you keep going along in the cycle. Well, there are many examples throughout that entire cycle that, including people with lived experience of disability, can enrich the research process and ultimately the outcome. I am a co-founder of a consortium, the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium, which is a group of community-based spinal cord injury organizations that we created about 8 years ago now to strengthen the voice of people with spinal cord injuries in spinal cord injury research. And we were invited to speak at an NIH conference called STI 2020, A Decade of Disruption. And we did some research in our community before we got there. And we asked the community through a survey 2 questions here. How do you feel, or do you feel like you need to increase your own knowledge or have a better understanding of research and the research process? And in blue, in the pie chart, you can see the majority of people said yes. I don't really understand the whole research cycle and research process, and I want to learn more. On the right-hand side, we asked people how much they agree with this statement. Currently, people living with spinal cord injuries and their families are left out of the research process until researchers are looking for clinical trial participants. And that's when they go to the organizations, oh, help me recruit, help me recruit. And so we presented that at the conference, and we did a follow-up survey afterwards to see where do people want to be involved. And they said they want to be involved in all the different areas, but they would really like to be advisors to research teams. And advisors can do a lot. So we know about some of the larger categories that people are interested in, but you can have advisors to your research team to shape your question. What aspects of bladder function or what aspects of bowel function are the most difficult, and how can we address that? But very importantly, people with lived experience can help with recruitment and retention. Do your inclusion and exclusion criteria really need to be that strict? Because if you really need them to be that strict, then you're going to lose out on a lot of people and you're going to lack generalizability. You have a statistical target for the number of people that you want to recruit, but if you have advisors to your team, you can really look at what's the burden of participation. And the burden of participation can influence your reality of reaching the number of participants. And then lastly, with the interpretation, so what? What does it mean that you have a P of 0.05? What does that mean in real life? And I just want to show this comment right here. It's a really great example of what someone using a wheelchair goes through is the thought process. So this person agrees to go out and meet his friends at the cinema. But you can think about this as going to an on-site research appointment. So he's thinking, okay, what happens if I try to get on the bus and they don't stop? What if I take an Uber, and how do I get my wheelchair in the Uber? What if I get there and there's stairs? What if I'm trying to catch the bus and the bus driver just blows me off? And this thought process is happening to all of us with a disability. Even just getting here today and planning out, it's very time consuming and it's very mentally draining. And you have to think about that when you think about the burden of our research that we're designing. So how do we enable engagement? I can tell you what's happened in the spinal cord injury field. 25 years ago, there really wasn't a lot of engagement. And then I published my study in 2004, and everybody started coming to Kim, saying, Kim, what does the spinal cord injury community want? And so then there started to be a few more investigators with spinal cord injury into the field, and they started going to us. And then we started saying, look, you can't just go to us, we need to be broadening throughout the community. And then since SCI 2020, actually, many of the funding agencies have either suggested strongly or actually made mandates that you include people with lived experience in your grant applications. And we're now in the area right here with the star where we're having these mandates and we're trying to build partnerships. But the community is actually a great resource and trying to build capacity for including many people with lived experience. And I just want to end here with one example that the North American SCI Consortium created and they launched just last year. It's a free online course that teaches people with spinal cord injuries and their caregivers about the research process. They don't need to be real scientists, but they just need to understand the process that they're going into. They can be better advisors and provide their lived experience that way. But it also created some modules that educate researchers and healthcare providers about what's it like to live with a spinal injury. And this was co-created by a very strong collaboration with many different individuals in the state and the process. These are just some examples of the online modules that are there. So I just wanted to conclude with the fact that by asking people with any kind of disability about what are your priorities. It doesn't even have to be about function. What are your priorities? We can reduce ableism in our research activities. And in spinal cord injury, we're starting to learn how people with spinal cord injuries weigh different benefits and risks related to research, and they're tied to their priorities. And we can now use this to actually be more successful in our research. And by partnering with the community in a meaningful way throughout the entire cycle of research and across the entire spectrum of translation, all the way to the community, we can limit the impact of ableism and strengthen the potential that our research is actually impactful for a broader